The best-selling music last year and in decades gone by. I've been waiting for the Australian Recording Industry Association to release the details of what were the best-selling singles and albums from last year, 2023. And today, on the 13th of January 2024, they finally released that information. I thought it might be interesting to have a look at what topped the charts this year or last year, and also perhaps in decades gone by. I thought I'd go back 10 years to 2013, then to 2003, and so on, way back to 1963. I think it's worth speaking a little bit about what the charts mean today compared with what they used to mean. Obviously, with the introduction of streaming, that's changed the whole way in which record sales need to be counted. I'm not honestly sure how they calculate album sales, given that people stream only a few tracks sometimes from albums. I'm one of those people who likes to listen to entire albums all the way through because I think it captures a moment in that artist's career. But I do also listen to mixes of tracks, of course. So how they calculate album sales from listening to those individual tracks, I'm not sure, but I guess I have to trust that they have some reasonably sound algorithm for that. It's also worth mentioning that I think streaming sales represent a much more accurate measure of what music people are actually listening to than do hard copy sales. I think these days people often buy vinyl albums just to add them to their collection. They don't necessarily listen to them. They're collectible items, perhaps for resale later at a better price. Or they may buy them for the album cover or the details inside, or they may listen to them once or twice, but then that's it. They go on the shelf and they're not listened to anymore. But with streaming, you know that that's what people are listening to, or at least, the very least, the first 30 seconds of a track. So it's a more accurate indication of what people are actually listening to than just the sales of vinyl or cassette or CD. And of course, the concept of a single has also changed because these tracks that make the top 100 are not necessarily songs that have been released as singles at all. They're just the tracks that people have been listening to from the album. There are always a few tracks that are released as singles or even prior to the release of the album, but by and large, the consumer decides what tracks are going to be singles these days, and I can't help thinking that that's a good thing too. But it does mean that the top selling tracks are not necessarily what we used to call singles. So without further ado, let's jump back in time, all the way back to 1963, when I was 6 years old. The number one single at that time was I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles. Probably no surprises there that the Beatles would hold the number one position with one of their songs. And the number one album was With the Beatles by, yes, the Beatles. Now, I wasn't able to find out actually what the number one album was in Australia in 1963, but in the UK it was With the Beatles, and I'm assuming that we pretty much followed the UK back in those days. I don't think I have to explain to anybody who the Beatles actually were, at least not to my audience, at least I hope not. I do think the days are coming, though, when people will not know who the Beatles were, or they may just have a vague recollection the way they might of Frank Sinatra or Dean Martin. After all, 1963 is 60 years ago. In 1973, the number one song was Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree. Now, I don't know how many of you remember that, by an outfit called Tony Orlando and Dawn. I have no idea who or what Dawn is, whether it's a person or some kind of band. That's one of those typical middle-of-the-road pop ballads telling a kind of tear-jerking story. And Tony Orlando and Dawn had a number of hits around that period. Most of us who were around that time probably remember it, but I doubt if anybody who wasn't has ever heard of the song. Now, the number one album at the time was Hot August Night by Neil Diamond. It was a live album, obviously, and I had a copy, as it seems did most people in Australia at the time. It certainly set the standard, I think, for live albums. It was one of those albums that, as I say, most people had, but everybody who was cool loved to hate. They still do. I, however, think it's a fantastic album. The live versions of some of Neil Diamond's songs are far better than the studio versions. His interacting with the crowd, his ad-libbing, the way he modifies the songs, all good stuff. And you may be one of those cool people who will never listen to it, but if you're not, I would recommend that you actually go back and have a listen to what the first real live album was like. 1983. Well, interesting year in Australia. The number one single in Australia was a thing called Australiana by a guy who called himself Ostentatious. His real name was Sandy Gutman. This is a spoken word comedy song, basically a string of corny puns based on Australian place names and a bunch of bad dad jokes. Pretty awful. But there you are, it made it to number one in 1983 here in Australia. Those of you who have a good memory for dates won't be surprised to learn that the number one album that year was Thriller by Michael Jackson. I'm pretty sure at this stage I don't need to explain who Michael Jackson was. 1993 was the year of Meat Loaf, and the number one single that year was I'd Do Anything for Love, but I Won't Do That. One of Meat Loaf's bloated, overblown rock ballads, written and produced by Jim Steinman. Everybody probably loves it. Everybody loved it in Australia in 1993, and it went to number one. Surprisingly, perhaps, the album didn't. The album that went to number one was The Bodyguard, the original soundtrack album by Whitney Houston. Poor old Whitney. We remember her fondly, I think. In 2003, the single that went to number one in Australia was a song called Angels Brought Me Here. You probably won't have heard of that anywhere except in Australia, maybe not even in Australia by this stage. It was by an artist called Guy Sebastian, who's still pretty well known here in Australia. And it's not surprising that this song went to number one because Guy Sebastian was the winner of Australian Idol that year. It's an R&B pop sort of song. The number one album in Australia was also an Australian album, this time Innocent Eyes by Delta Goodrem. It's a pop, adult contemporary kind of album. She co-wrote most of the songs with Gary Barlow, amongst others, and Barlow is also one of the producers. It was a big year for Delta Goodrem in both a bad sense and a good sense. She had the number one selling album for the year, but she was also diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. Fortunately, as far as I'm aware, she made a full recovery from that and is still going strong today. 2013, and Girls, Who Runs the World? Girls. The number one single for that year was Raw by Katy Perry. You can't really get more mainstream pop than that. The best album for the year was The Truth About Love by Pink. So now for this year. But first, the drum roll. I tried to make some guesses about what the number one single might have been for last year. I thought among the options were probably Jack Harlow, Miley Cyrus, Olivia Rodrigo, maybe Doja Cat. In fact, it was Miley Cyrus with Flowers. A number of very good tracks on that album of hers. And there'll be no surprises, I think, for those of you who follow contemporary music and follow the music charts, that the number one album is, another drum roll please, 1989, Taylor's Version by Taylor Swift. At the present time, it's still number one on the charts and has been for 11 consecutive weeks. Taylor Swift also had the number 2 album this year with Midnights, and she had 3 other albums in the top 10, including the original version of 1989, which some people, I believe, prefer to the re-recorded version. She had 10 albums in the top 100. So there you are, the top selling singles and albums over the decades, including last year. In 2023, girls still run the world. Given Taylor Swift's meteoric rise from fame to mega fame over the last couple of years, it's no surprise that she dominated the charts, both the album charts and the single charts. Even though she didn't get to the number 1 position on the single charts, she was probably her own worst enemy in having so many songs competing for that position.